Well, I've never done ashes in my life, and that's what she wanted. And then she wants me to do it and put the same.
A single gunshot in Naples, Florida, ended a boy's life. The victim was Duane "Dog" Chapman's teenage grandson. For decades, Dog made a living hunting people trying to outrun their past. But when tragedy struck his own family, there was no one to chase and nowhere to run. For more than 6 months, the Chapmans said little about what had happened that night. How did one heartbreaking loss leave the man known as Dog searching for answers of his own? Join us as we uncover the heartbreaking tragedy of Duane "Dog" Chapman. The boy who learned to survive first. The man who'd spend his life finding people running from their worst night once had a worst night of his own. It began more than 70 years earlier in a modest house in Denver, where a little boy learned that love could leave bruises. He thought every kid got hit the way he did. His father swung a paddle carved from a piece of flooring, and because the boy had nothing to measure it against, he assumed this was simply what fathers did. The blows left marks he learned to hide under long sleeves, even in Denver's summer heat. He didn't have a word for what was happening to him, and he wouldn't find one for decades. By 13, he'd had enough of classrooms and traded them for a motorcycle gang instead. And it didn't take long before his name showed up on 18 separate robbery charges. Then came the night that nearly ended everything before it started. He was sitting in a car outside the home of a 69-year-old man named Jerry Oliver, while a friend went inside to buy marijuana. What came next was gunfire, and when his friend stumbled back out, he drove him straight to the hospital, then doubled back to the scene because that was just what you did. Jerry died before morning. Under Texas law at the time, sitting in that car made him just as guilty as the man who pulled the trigger. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 5 years. He'd serve 18 months of it. Prison is where he became Dog. The nickname wasn't a tabloid invention or a producer's idea. A guard hung it on him after he helped stop a fellow inmate mid-escape. Half as a joke, that inmate had no idea he'd just named a future television star. When Duane walked out, freedom didn't come with a plan. It came with a used car lot and a bail bonds office. And somewhere in that world, he met a woman who'd change everything. Alice Beth Barmore. Though the world would only ever know her as Beth, their relationship took its time. Both had married other people first, divorced, circled back around to each other, and finally built something real together in the mid-1990s. Then, in 2003, Duane's life changed again, and this time the whole world was watching. Andrew Luster, the Max Factor Cosmetics heir, had been convicted on 86 counts of sexual misconduct without ever bothering to show up for his own trial. And instead of facing prison, he disappeared into the resort towns of coastal Mexico, the kind of place where a rich man on the run can last as long as his money holds out. Duane and his hunt team, including his son Leland and his longtime partner Tim, tracked Luster down on the streets of Puerto Vallarta and put him in cuffs themselves. No local police required. It should have ended there, with the fugitive caught and the headline written. Instead, it was only the beginning of a much bigger mess. Fame arrived fast. So did the fine print. A Mexican court ruled there was enough reason to try Duane for unlawfully detaining Luster during that very capture. And for months, the arrest that made him famous looked like it might land him behind bars in a country that wasn't his own. It took Hawaii's own legislature stepping in on his behalf before the charges were finally dropped. 2 years later, in 2005, he tried to marry Beth at a Las Vegas courthouse, and they arrived too late in the day for it to count. A mistake that took 2 decades and a manhunt career to finally get right, and one they never stopped laughing about. In November 2007, A recording surfaced of Duane using a racial slur while talking to his own son, a call that son had sold to a tabloid for a payday. A&E suspended the show within days. The apology tour that followed was public and humiliating, and years later he was still bringing it up unprompted, refusing to let anyone forget it, including himself. By early 2010, at the height of Dog the Bounty Hunter's success, Duane Chapman had become a household name. Then, in the spring of 2012, graphic death threats started arriving by email, specific enough about hurting his family that the FBI opened an investigation. Millions of people tuned in every week to watch a convicted felon chase down other people's mistakes for a living. Not everyone watching wished him well, and nobody watching at home knew the real story was just getting started. The losses that would define the second half of his life were already lining up, and the first one was closer than anyone in his family could imagine. The night before the wedding. One day. That's all that stood between Duane and the biggest day of his life. He was set to marry Beth in Hawaii in May 2006, the woman who'd spent the last decade building a life with him that nobody, including them, had expected to work. The night before the wedding, a phone call came in from Alaska. His 23-year-old daughter, Barbara, had died in a car accident near her home in Fairbanks. His family decided to hold the news until morning, so he woke up on his wedding day and learned, before anything else that day, that his daughter was gone. Grief doesn't wait for a good time, and neither did the wedding. After talking it over with the minister, Duane decided to go through with it anyway. He and Beth agreed not to tell their guests until the reception, which quietly turned into something closer to a memorial for Barbara than a celebration for the two of them. Guests who'd come dressed for celebration found themselves holding each other, unsure whether to smile or grieve. It was the first time joy and grief showed up on the same day of his life. It would not be the last. In 2018, doctors told Beth her cancer was back and had spread to her lungs. Stage 4. Duane and Beth had turned their partnership into something the public adored. The show, the business, the family, all of it stitched together. And by his own account, across more than 30 years, the two of them were apart only a handful of days. In 2017, she'd already faced this once, a 13-hour surgery for stage 2 throat cancer. And by that November, doctors believed it was gone. She chose to spend what time she had left the way she'd spent the last 30 years, out in the field with her family, chasing fugitives, instead of in a hospital bed fighting for a few extra months. That decision only makes sense once you know what came before it, a marriage where cancer was now the only thing keeping them apart. Cancer wasn't going to decide how she spent the time she had left. She would. For a while, it looked like she'd won. It hadn't. On June 26, 2019, Beth died at Queen's Medical Center in Honolulu, surrounded by the people who loved her. She was 51. Duane later described waking at the exact hour she used to rise for her morning hike and finding a strange kind of peace, picturing her taking that same walk somewhere he couldn't follow. A man who had already survived prison, an international manhunt, and his own daughter's death the night before his wedding should have had nothing left to break. Losing Beth broke it anyway. Within weeks, his own body started failing in ways that had nothing to do with age. This time, the danger wasn't behind him. It was sitting in his chest. How long would it take someone to notice? The ticking time bomb. Grief didn't just break Duane's heart the way people say it does. Weeks after Beth's funeral, he was rushed to the hospital with chest pains so severe doctors feared a heart attack. That particular fear turned out to be wrong. What they found instead was a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot lodged in his lungs, serious enough that his own doctor told him bluntly he was running out of time if he kept avoiding treatment. Duane had spent years telling people he wasn't afraid to die. Only after Beth was gone did he realize how wrong that had been. He called it, simply, a broken heart. The kind medicine can only do so much to fix. While his body was failing, his family was falling apart in public. By now, the Chapman family wasn't a simple phrase. 5 marriages and 13 children across those marriages meant that when grief hit, it didn't just hit one household, it hit a small nation of siblings, half-siblings, and step-siblings, all raised in different corners of Duane's life. Within weeks of Beth's death, his daughter Lisa started accusing Moon Angel, a woman who'd worked alongside the family for 30 years and had once been Beth's own assistant, of moving in on her grieving father. Another daughter, Cecily, Beth's daughter, joined in, and for a while the internet watched the Chapmans turn their grief into a very public war over a man's love life. Duane did briefly propose to Moon, and the whole thing turned out to be a staged test arranged with a television doctor. On camera, Moon told him plainly she couldn't marry him, that she loved him and Beth only as friends. The staged engagement didn't last. The cracks in that family ran deeper than anything the cameras caught. Lisa had written, years earlier, about a difficult childhood shaped by conflict at home, and about once falsely accusing her own father of something terrible after she had actually been abused by someone else close to the family. It was a wound with nothing to do with ratings, and Lisa had been carrying it long before any camera did. More loss kept finding Duane, even in the years nobody was watching closely. On November 30th, 2022, David Robinson, his longtime right-hand man, collapsed suddenly during a work call at his own dining room table and couldn't be revived. He was 50. An autopsy later found an undiagnosed heart condition no one had known was there. Duane called him a brother. Then, in 2023, his daughter Bonnie's house burned to the ground, taking nearly everything she owned and all 6 of her pets with it, animals she'd raised and loved for years. In 2023, the family tree threw one more surprise at him. Duane publicly revealed he'd discovered a son he hadn't known about, John. One more branch on a tree that never seemed to stop growing. 2 years before any of that, in September 2021, Duane found something worth holding on to again. He met Francie Frayne, a woman who had also lost her spouse, and the two married that fall. On paper, it read like 2 grieving people finding their way back to each other. A real second chance built on shared understanding instead of headlines. The worst chapters weren't behind him, after all. The months nobody explained. In July 2025, Duane and Francie's family gathered around a tragedy that at first looked almost too cruel to be anything but an accident. Francie's son from her previous marriage, Gregory Zecca, was watching a UFC fight with his 13-year-old son, Anthony, at a friend's apartment in Naples, Florida. Sometime that evening, a single gunshot rang out, and Anthony was killed. Officers arrived to find the boy with a gunshot wound, a firearm sitting in the kitchen, and Gregory standing nearby with an empty holster on his waistband. Gregory was still performing CPR on his son when deputies arrived. At the time, authorities called it an isolated incident. No arrests were made. Duane and Francie put out a short statement asking for prayers as they grieved the loss of their grandson. And for months, that was where the story stayed. A family absorbing an unthinkable accident, choosing privacy over explanation. Then, more than 6 months later, in February 2026, everything the public believed about that night changed. The Collier County Sheriff's Office announced Gregory had been arrested and charged with aggravated manslaughter of a child with a firearm, along with using a firearm while under the influence. What came out was far harder to sit with than the word accident had ever suggested. Gregory had reportedly been drinking for hours at a bar before the shooting, bought more alcohol afterward, then used both alcohol and marijuana with his son present. Investigators said he'd been handling the loaded gun all evening, practicing drawing it from his waistband, even dry firing it, before it went off and struck his own son. Sheriff Kevin Rambosk didn't soften it, calling it a heartbreaking and preventable tragedy, and crediting his detectives for an exhaustive investigation that examined witness statements, forensic testing, and search warrants before the arrest. Gregory was placed on a psychiatric hold afterward, reportedly overwhelmed by grief rather than under suspicion at that point, and he now faces the possibility of life in prison. For Duane, a man who'd spent decades sitting across from criminals offering them a version of grace most people wouldn't extend to a stranger, this was a version of that same story he could never have prepared for. Except this time, it was his own family sitting on the other side of the law he'd spent his life enforcing. This wasn't the kind of tragedy you simply came back from. And still, in the months that followed, Duane kept posting lighthearted family photos and continuing his charity work, less because the grief had lifted than because moving forward was the only response he'd ever known. There was no fixing what happened to Anthony. So what was a man who'd spent his whole life helping people through their worst nights supposed to do the morning after living through his own? A mission that never ended. Duane has always described his life's work as something closer to a ministry than a job. For nearly 50 years, he made a living finding people at the exact moment they'd run out of road. And instead of just cuffing them, he'd talk to them, pray with them, try to hand them some version of the second chance nobody else was offering. The public believed it too. His memoir, telling that exact story, landed at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, proof that people weren't just watching a bounty hunter on television. They were watching a man argue, book after book, that anyone could come back from the worst thing they'd ever done. He called it a kind of backseat evangelism, conversations that happened in the back of a car on the way to jail, long before a camera ever showed up to film it. Today, at 73, Duane lives in Florida with Francie, still working the exact job that made him famous 50 years ago. In May 2026, he was out on the streets of Cobb County, Georgia, walking alongside local police to help bring in a fugitive, the same job he's been doing since before some of those officers were born. The next month, he was at a comic convention in Texas, signing autographs for fans who'd waited in line for a photo with the man from television. That same spring, he threw himself into something with real stakes behind it. A nationwide scavenger hunt stretched across more than 15,000 animal shelters, all built around finding one dog who had spent 15 years waiting in a kennel for a family that never came. A prison guard once tagged him with the name Dog as a throwaway joke. 50 years later, it's the reason a 15-year-old shelter dog nobody else wanted is about to get found. The hunt was backed by a community that had already raised over $15 million for shelters, and it was set to end with Duane personally meeting whoever solved it, at the shelter where the dog was finally found. A man who spent his whole career finding people nobody else could find, spending his 70s finding a dog nobody else would. Now he and Francie run a media ministry together called Light Up the Darkness, built around the same instinct that put a nickname on him 50 years ago: find the people the world has given up on. Francie, herself a survivor of domestic violence, is building an extension of it called the House of Bounty, a retreat meant to give trafficking and abuse survivors somewhere safe to recover. The same lifeline he'd spent his career handing to strangers in the back of a car. It is the one part of his life that still feels finished. Gregory's case is not. It is still moving through the courts, and nobody in the Chapman family knows yet what the next few years actually look like. For now, all Duane has is what he's always had: showing up one more time, without any guarantee that this is the last time he'll have to. Do you think a man can carry this much loss and still heal from it? Or does grief like this just get carried for the rest of a lifetime? And when a tragedy happens inside a family, is it fair to ask whether anyone besides the person holding the gun bears responsibility? Or is that his alone to answer for? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.